Just after 8 in the morning on February the 4th, 1864, a worker at the Colt Armory in Hartford, Connecticut, smelled smoke coming from the attic. Within minutes, it was in the roof. Within the hour, the entire East Armory, 260 acres of forge shops, foundries, and factory floor on the bank of the Connecticut River, was engulfed. At 9 o'clock, the ornamental globe above the main building, the one that carried the company's own emblem, a statue of a rearing horse, crashed down through the burning structure. 900 men stood outside and watched the building that employed them collapse into itself. The country was in the third year of its most violent war. The armory they were watching burn was at that hour manufacturing revolvers and rifle muskets under some of the largest ordnance contracts the Union had issued to any private company in America, and some among the crowd already suspected sabotage, wondering aloud whether Confederate sympathizers had finally found a way to strike at Hartford without ever setting foot on a battlefield. This is not a story about a gun. It is a story about two men and a machine they built that could survive its own destruction. One of those men has a statue, the other does not. By the end of this, you will understand why that is backward. The men were Samuel Colt and Elisha Root, and the machine was the Hartford Armory itself, the factory on the river that, within 3 years of watching its own roof collapse, would be rebuilt to look exactly as it had before, dome and all. We are going to go back to 1814, to a watchmaking family and a ship's wheel, and follow both threads forward until they meet on that riverbank, and then follow what happened after the men who built it were both gone. Every week we take apart the story stamped on the barrel flat of an American manufacturer, the founders, the machinists, and the decisions that built a company or eventually lost it. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Samuel Colt was born in Hartford on July the 19th, 1814, one of 8 children of a textile manufacturer named Christopher Colt. As a boy, he took things apart to see how they worked, which is a common enough trait in inventors and a mostly useless one until it isn't. At 16, on a sea voyage, he watched the ship's wheel turn and noticed how its spokes locked into place against a clutch as the helmsman brought the ship onto a new heading. A wheel that could rotate and then lock precisely again and again. He carved a wooden model of a revolving cylinder mechanism before he had any formal training in gunsmithing at all. He was, by every account, expelled from Amherst Academy in Massachusetts, where he had gone to study navigation, not firearms. His father funded his first attempts at a working model built by gunsmiths in Baltimore, and then, when they failed to fire reliably and the money kept disappearing, stopped. Colt was not yet 20 and already effectively broke. So he did something almost nobody expects from a future arms magnate. He took to the road as a traveling showman, performing under the stage name Dr. Colt, charging admission for public demonstrations of nitrous oxide, laughing gas, to audiences across the United States and Canada. He used the proceeds to keep refining his design and eventually to travel to England and France to secure patents there in 1835. In February of 1836, he received United States Patent number 138 for a repeating handgun with a revolving, locking cylinder. He was 22 years old. He built his first factory that same year in Paterson, New Jersey, and began production of what collectors now call the Colt Patterson, a 5-shot revolver initially offered in .28 caliber with a slightly larger .36 caliber model following within the year. He was, by every measure available at the time, a 22-year-old with a patent, a small factory, and no proof yet that either the Army or the American public actually wanted what he was selling. It failed. Soldiers and frontiersmen did not immediately trust a 5-shot cylinder over a musket they already knew how to load. Sales were slow. By 1842, the Patterson Company had closed. Samuel Colt spent the next several years doing almost anything except making guns, developing an electrically detonated naval mine, running an early underwater telegraph cable business, and generally acting like a man whose great invention had already come and gone. In 1847, a Texas Ranger named Samuel Hamilton Walker walked into Colt's life with an order that would resurrect the entire enterprise. Walker had used the earlier Patterson revolvers against Comanche raiders on the Texas frontier and wanted something bigger for the war then underway with Mexico. A revolver powerful enough, in his words, to be used effectively against a mounted enemy at 50 yards or more. Together they designed what became known as the Colt Walker, a 4.5-pound 6-shot revolver with a 9-inch barrel, chambered for a .44 caliber ball, loaded over 60 grains of black powder, nearly twice the powder charge of any other revolver then in production, with a muzzle velocity approaching 1,300 feet per second. It was the largest and most powerful production handgun in the world at the time, and it stayed that way for the better part of 90 years. Colt had no working factory left, so the guns were built under contract at Eli Whitney Jr.'s works in Whitneyville, Connecticut. The order was for 1,000 revolvers for the Army, with another 100 for Colt and Walker to sell or give away as they saw fit. Nearly a third of the military guns would eventually be returned for repair, and more than a few reportedly burst under the strain of their own charge, evidence that Colt had rushed a design into war before it was fully proven. It saved him anyway. Walker himself was killed that October, leading a charge at the Battle of Huamantla, carrying a pair of the revolvers that bore his name. He never lived to see what his order had restarted, that is, the revival. It is not yet the Empire. For the Empire, we need to go back further, to a different boy in a different Massachusetts mill town who Samuel Colt already happened to know. Elisha Root was born in 1808 near Springfield, Massachusetts. He started work as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill at the age of 10. At 15, he was apprenticed in a machine shop in Ware, Massachusetts, and from there he moved through machine shops in Chicopee and eventually to the Collins Company in Canton, Connecticut, then the largest axe manufacturer in the country, where he invented an early die casting process that transformed how the company produced tools. Colleagues who worked alongside him for years later described him as a man who never manifested anxiety to obtain large compensation for his services, a superior mechanic with great inventive faculties who also possessed the rarer and less glamorous gift of prudence, the judgment to know the line between the possible and the merely visionary. Root and Colt had known each other since they were young men. The story handed down is that a teenage Colt once detonated one of his early inventions, an electrically triggered underwater mine, in a public demonstration that doused the watching crowd in mud, and that Root was among the onlookers who helped Colt escape their anger. Two mechanically obsessed young men from the same corner of New England, one already thinking about spectacle and salesmanship, the other already thinking about how things are actually made. In 1849, with his business finally recovering on the strength of the Walker order and its successors, Samuel Colt hired Elisha Root away from the Collins Company to come to Hartford and build him a factory. This is the convergence point. Colt had the idea, the patents, and by now a considerable talent for promotion. He did not, by most accounts, have the specific genius required to make 10,000 identical, interchangeable revolvers a year. Root did. In 1855, Colt completed a new armory on the banks of the Connecticut River, the largest privately owned arms manufacturing plant in the world, and incorporated the business as Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company. Above the main building, he raised a distinctive domed roof, elaborately decorated, topped with a statue of a rearing horse mounted on a decorative globe, the company's own emblem given a permanent, visible home. The most credible explanation for the design is Colt's own business history rather than any architectural fashion, a nod to the Russian government contracts and connections that had been among his earliest and largest customers abroad. Whatever the reason, it was and remains one of the more distinctive and recognizable pieces of industrial architecture in America. Root immediately set about transforming the factory, and by the time he was finished, the transformation was total. He designed and built close to 400 separate machines to produce the parts that went into every Colt revolver, parts precise enough to be interchangeable between guns without hand-fitting, a principle other American gun makers had gestured toward, but that Root perfected at industrial scale. Among his inventions was a universal milling machine built for Colt at the Lincoln Iron Works in Hartford that became known as the Lincoln Miller. More than 150,000 of them were eventually sold, making it the single most widely used machine tool in 19th century America. Under Root's supervision, roughly 80% of the labor that went into a Colt firearm was performed by machine rather than by hand. By 1856, the Hartford Armory was producing 150 finished weapons every single day. This is not a story about a gun. It is a story about credit and about who a country chooses to remember. The engineer and historian Joseph Wickham Rowe put it as plainly as it has ever been put. The credit for the revolver, he wrote, belongs to Colt. For the way they were made, it belongs mainly to Root. Samuel Colt's name went on the company, the patents, and eventually the dome. Elisha Root's name went, for the most part, nowhere that most people would ever read it. By 1860, Samuel Colt could see the war coming before most of Washington could admit it. The armory was already running extended shifts in anticipation, and when the Civil War arrived in 1861, the Hartford factory, alongside its rifle musket production, fulfilled some of the largest ordnance contracts the Union government issued to any single private manufacturer: revolvers for cavalry and officers, muskets for infantry. Output measured not in the hundreds the Patterson factory had once struggled to sell, but in the hundreds of thousands. But there was a crack already running through Colt's dominance, and it had nothing to do with the war. A former Colt employee named Rollin White had patented the bored-through cylinder, the design innovation that would let a revolver load and fire self-contained metallic cartridges instead of loose powder and ball. Rather than sell that patent to his old employer, White licensed it to Colt's chief rival, Smith & Wesson. For as long as that patent held, Colt could not legally build a cartridge revolver at all. The company that had defined the American revolver was locked out of the next generation of the American revolver by a man who had once worked on its own factory floor. Samuel Colt did not live to see how that story resolved. He died in his home in Hartford on January the 10th, 1862, at the age of 47, leaving a pregnant wife, Elizabeth Jarvis Colt, and a controlling interest in the company that now belonged to her. She was 35 years old and had just inherited the largest private armory on earth. 2 years later came the morning we opened on. The fire of February the 4th, 1864, tore through the East Armory at the height of wartime production, doing an estimated $2 million in damage in 1864 money and putting 900 men temporarily out of work. Some believed at the time that Confederate sympathizers had set it deliberately, given the timing and the scale of the Union contracts running through the building. No conclusive evidence for sabotage was ever found, and most historians now consider it accidental. What matters more than the cause is what Elizabeth Colt did next. After her husband's death, she had, unlike Sam himself, taken out an insurance policy on the factory buildings. That policy is the reason the company did not simply end that morning. Production shifted immediately into a converted tobacco warehouse and other undamaged buildings on the sprawling Hartford campus, while Elizabeth Colt committed to a full rebuild. The destruction had been total enough that the fire briefly pushed government contracts toward competing manufacturers, Remington, Smith & Wesson, and the Springfield Armory, companies happy to absorb whatever orders Hartford could not fill that year. It took 3 years and a design led by General William B. Franklin to bring the armory back. By 1867, the East Armory stood again, a multi-story brick structure, much as it had been, and above it once more the distinctive domed roof, and above that once more the statue of a rearing horse. The building came back. The two men who had built the company underneath it did not both get to see it happen. Elisha Root took over as president of the Colt Armories after Samuel Colt's death and ran them through the rest of the war. He died in 1865, 2 years before the rebuilt armory was finished, and control passed to Elizabeth Colt's brother Richard Jarvis, who would serve as president for the next 36 years. The post-war company that Jarvis and Elizabeth Colt ran was for a while playing catch-up. The roll-and-white patent that had locked Colt out of cartridge revolvers did not expire until 1869. Only then could Colt engineers William Mason and Charles Brinkerhoff Richards begin serious work on a bored-through cylinder of their own. Their design competed in United States Army trials in 1872 and was adopted the following year as the new Model Army metallic cartridge revolving pistol, chambered in .45 caliber. One of Colt's largest distributors began advertising it under a name that stuck far better than the official one, the Peacemaker. Colt's chief competition through this stretch was not just Winchester, but the man who had briefly locked Colt out of the cartridge revolver market in the first place. Smith & Wesson, still holding whatever advantage the roll-and-white years had given them, remained the company Colt would spend the rest of its history looking over its shoulder at. 45 miles away in New Haven, Winchester was finishing its own lever-action rifle that same year, the Model 1873, and the two guns would be paired together in American folklore for the next century and a half as the guns that won the West. Colt's revolver went through 4 separate production eras across the next 100 years, the first running from 1873 into the 1940s, with later runs reviving it for collectors and enthusiasts in the 1950s, 70s, and again from the 1990s onward. More than 450,000 of the original pattern were built. It is difficult to find another American firearm from that century still manufactured by its original maker 150 years later in one form or another into the present day. The gun that would come to symbolize the American West almost did not exist at all, delayed for the better part of a decade by a patent Colt's own former employee had sold to somebody else. We could stop the story there, at the Peacemaker, at the myth fully formed. But Colt's real pattern, the one that explains everything that happens next, is not a story of steady dominance. It is a story of a company that kept arriving late to its own revolutions, and somehow, for most of a century, kept winning anyway. Colt could outdesign almost anyone who ever competed against it. What the company could not do forever, it turned out, was outbid them. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States Army went looking for a semi-automatic pistol to replace its revolvers, driven directly by reports out of the Philippine-American War, where American troops armed with .38 caliber revolvers found their rounds simply were not stopping determined Moro fighters at close range. The Army ordered a set of ballistic tests, the Thompson-Lagarde trials of 1904, to settle once and for all what caliber the next service pistol needed to fire. The answer came back, .45. Colt partnered with the designer John Moses Browning, and the two of them spent roughly 7 years and several prototype generations, the models of 1905, 1907, 1909, and 1910, refining the design through repeated Army trials against a rival submission from Savage Arms. Every deficiency the Army identified, Browning fixed. It needed a slide stop, he built one. It needed a grip safety so cavalry troopers could not accidentally shoot their own horses. He built that too. In March of 1911, in the deciding head-to-head test, Browning's pistol fired 6,000 rounds over 2 days without a single malfunction. The Savage suffered 37. The board approved Browning's design unanimously. It entered service as the model of 1911 and went on to become the longest-serving handgun in American military history, carried through 2 world wars, Korea and into Vietnam, not formally retired until the 1980s. That should have been the high point of the story. It was not the last one. In the late 1950s, a struggling aircraft components company called Armalite, working with an engineer named Eugene Stoner, who had trained not as a gunsmith but as an aircraft designer, developed a lightweight rifle built from aluminum and modern alloys, the AR-15. Armalite could not manufacture it at the volume the military would eventually demand, and in 1959 sold the design and manufacturing rights to Colt. Colt refined it, sold early production runs to the Air Force for base security, and then watched as commercial models shipped to Special Forces units in Vietnam came back with glowing field reports. By 1964, it had been adopted as the Army's primary combat rifle, designated the M16. The rifle was controversial from the start. Compared against the older, heavier M14 it replaced, the lightweight aluminum-framed AR-15 drew heavy criticism for a perceived lack of reliability and stopping power. Criticism that only grew worse after the Army changed the cartridge's powder formulation to a more corrosive mixture without properly informing troops in the field. A decision that caused a wave of jamming failures in Vietnam that had nothing to do with Stoner's or Colt's original engineering. Colt would go on to manufacture something on the order of 8 million of them across every branch of American service, and dozens of Allied militaries, a rifle it had not originally designed, purchased from a company that could not afford to finish building it. This is not a story about a gun. It is a story about a company that kept winning by buying, marrying, or absorbing other people's best ideas, from Elisha Root's machines to William Mason's cylinder to Eugene Stoner's rifle, and then putting its own name on the result. For most of a century that worked. Then it stopped working. In 1988, with Colt's own patents on the design by then expired, the Belgian manufacturer FN underbid Colt by $57.50 per rifle to win the contract for the improved M16A2. Colt held on to smaller contracts and kept developing shortened carbine variants of the same basic rifle, a lineage stretching back to Vietnam-era models, eventually refined into the XM4 carbine. That design was formally adopted as the M4 in 1994 and carried by American troops through Iraq and Afghanistan for the better part of 2 decades. Arguably the single most recognizable American infantry weapon of the entire war on terror. Then in 2013, FN won that contract too, a deal worth just under $77 million, beating out both Colt and Remington, who had already chipped away at part of the M4 business in earlier rounds of bidding. It came down in the end to price per unit and little else. FN simply underbid Colt on a contract for a rifle Colt had carried through 2 wars, and the Pentagon, which does not sentimentalize its suppliers, took the cheaper number. The company that had manufactured America's rifle since Vietnam no longer held a current contract to manufacture America's rifle. 2 years later, in 2015, Colt's manufacturing filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Colt did not lose because the rifle stopped working. The M4 kept killing, and it kept getting carried. Colt lost a bid. That is a smaller and stranger thing than a company failing, and it is closer to the truth of what actually happened. Colt emerged from bankruptcy in January of 2016, but the deeper trend did not reverse. Police departments increasingly switched to polymer frame pistols from Glock, cheaper, lighter, and holding more rounds than Colt's aging designs, while a new generation of budget and premium competitors alike ate into markets Colt had once simply assumed were its own by birthright. Smith & Wesson, the very company that had once outmaneuvered Colt with the Rollin White patent a century and a half earlier, continued to grow into a far larger competitor. In 2020, Colt's parent company listed shares on the Prague Stock Exchange. In February of 2021, the Czech firm Česká Zbrojovka Group announced an agreement to acquire 100% of Colt for $220 million in cash, plus more than 1 million newly issued shares of its own stock, with an additional earnout tied to Colt's future performance. The deal closed that May. Colt's own chief executive at the time framed it not as a surrender, but as the next stage of a turnaround already underway. 5 years of restored operations and financial performance that had put the company in a position to combine rather than simply survive. In April of 2022, the Czech parent company renamed itself Colt CZ Group. At the time of the acquisition, Colt's relationship with the United States Army was already more than 175 years old, dating back to the Walker Order, and Colt's Canadian subsidiary remained the designated exclusive supplier of small arms to the Canadian military. The oldest continuously operating American gunmaker was now and remains owned from Prague. The name survived every one of these failures. The ownership did not. That is not a tragedy exactly. It is closer to what happens to almost anything built well enough to outlast the individual ambition that started it. Original Colt Walker revolvers, the guns that resurrected the company in 1847, now sell at auction into the high six figures, one going for $499,375 in a 2022 premier sale. Early trial pistols from the Browning collaboration, prototypes that never saw mass production, have sold for well over $200,000 apiece. And a single unserialized Model 1909 test pistol fired at Fort Myer under the direct supervision of John Browning himself sold for more than $117,000. None of that is sentiment. It reflects an impossibility of replication, the specific hand-fitted relationship between a particular action and a particular barrel in an era before Root's machines made every part identical to every other, and the historical weight of holding an object that was present at the actual hinge points of American manufacturing history. Here is the detail almost nobody who visits the old Hartford Armory today walks away knowing. The site is now preserved as Coltsville National Historical Park. Inside its grounds stands a memorial to Samuel Colt, statues marking him at different points in his life, along with monuments and markers across the district that bear his name. There is no comparable statue of Elisha Root, the man Joseph Wickham Rowe credited with the way the guns were actually made, the man who built the 400 machines and the Lincoln Miller and the manufacturing system that turned a failed patent holder's second chance into the largest private armory on earth, is remembered mostly in footnotes and machinist trade journals. Samuel Colt got the statue. Root got the sentence in a book almost nobody outside the trade has read. This was never really a story about a gun or even about a company. It is a story about a machine that made machines, a factory Root built so precisely and so redundantly that it could burn to the ground during the busiest week of a civil war and be standing again, dome and all, 3 years later, run for a time by a woman its founder never got to see run it, sold decades later to buyers on another continent, and still be recognizable as the same building. Samuel Colt sold the idea. Elisha Root built the thing that could survive Samuel Colt. Today, if you stand on the Hartford riverbank and look up, the distinctive domed roof is still there, catching the light. And at the very top, above a national historical park, above a company now headquartered across an ocean, the statue of a rearing horse still stands where the rebuilt version was placed in 1867, watching the same river Samuel Colt chose in 1848 because it was close enough to the deep water shipping he needed, and far enough from anyone who could tell him no. Below it, some of the old worker cottages Colt built for his employees are still lived in. The Church Elizabeth Colt, raised in memory of her husband and their children, still holds services. None of the men who actually built the machine underneath that dome are alive to see any of it. Not Colt, not Root, not Elizabeth, not the 900 workers who watched it burn in 1864. The dome does not need them to be. That was the entire point of building it. The way Root built it in the first place, it survived a catastrophic fire. It survived a corporate bankruptcy. It survived being sold outright to a company on another continent. It is still standing.